Welcome back to Task and Purpose. I'm your average infantryman, Cappy. The UK Ministry of Defense just confirmed the assessment that 4,700 Russian military vehicles of all types and 80,000 soldiers are estimated to be casualties. In response to these losses, Putin ordered the military to increase their forces by 137,000 soldiers. But the decree doesn't really state where all of these able-bodied people are going to come from. We're going to analyze the growing evidence that it's probably going to come from some pretty questionable sources. Ukraine, on their part, has likely lost 40,000 soldiers as casualties, and they've declared martial law. Most men between the ages of 18 and 60 in Ukraine are banned from even leaving the country in case they're going to be asked to fight. We've been seeing both Russia and Ukraine take significant losses in the war. The question of how these armies rearm and resupply is becoming more important to the outcome of the war. There are already reports of both sides sending new recruits who are past optimal fighting age at 50 years old to the front lines with very little training. Moscow's pulling ancient T-62 tanks out of reserve to replace destroyed equipment. With the current state of the Russian economy, they've had to get creative in order to keep their war machine going. The International Monetary Fund believes Russia's GDP will take a 6% hit this year, further hampering any efforts to resupply their forces. We've seen a large number of outside groups coming to help Russia in their invasion, from Chechens, Belarusians, mercenaries, the Chinese government, and in one unconfirmed report, apparently 100,000 North Koreans were offered to help join the fight. If an outside army were to back Russia, it could change the tide of the war, and there is a lot of historical precedence for this happening. When China joined the North Koreans in the Korean War, their forces were vital in preventing the United States from decisively winning. In this video, we're going to break down all of the ways that Russia is leveraging these outside groups, and if it's going to be enough to turn the tide in Russia's favor. But first, one thing that I've noticed all of these future tanks have in common is durable high-tech computers. And the best place to go for rugged next-generation computational power is our partner Dell. They have extreme reinforced mil-spec laptops and tablets that can handle any mission environment, given its thermal and physical shock control. So whether you're on a camping trip or a deployment to a war zone, these are the perfect computers. Dell has high-powered gaming rigs with crystal clear monitors. If you like, you can join the Dell Membership Rewards program at no cost to gain access to specialty pricing, exclusive offers, early access to products, and free expedited delivery with up to 3% back in rewards. If you guys don't love your purchase, you can return it within 30 days. Dell's offering veterans and their families 10% off their order to show their military appreciation. When you buy a Dell, you automatically get their premium support with no hassle. Click the link in the description to check out Dell's arsenal of mil-spec, rugged computers and gaming systems. Now, resourcing a war can be tricky business, and countries are often not able to conduct a war without assistance from other nations. Now, during its heyday, the Soviet Union devoted upwards of 20% to 25% of its economy towards military spending, creating massive numbers of weapons, gear, vehicles, and ammunition. The effects of this can still be seen today, with countless countries still using exported Soviet weapons and vehicles like the AK-47 or the T-72 tank. The reason this could be achieved was because of their centrally controlled economy. The government dictated what and how much of the economy would be directed towards the military-industrial complex. Since the fall of the Soviet Union, however, the shift has been towards a market economy. It now only spends about 4% of their GDP towards defense. Because of this shift, modern-day Russia has had to include some unconventional means of carrying out its military objectives. If you look at historical cases, it's not uncommon to see Russia recruiting outside personnel to fight either alongside or instead of Russian forces. Beginning in 2014, the Kremlin started using mercenary groups in conjunction with average soldiers. The now infamous Russian-based private military company called Wagner Group was initially hired and deployed in order to conduct training and to fight with separatist forces. This organization is about 8,000 soldiers in size, which might not sound like a lot, but we have to remember there are all combat arms here. It's all teeth and no nail, so to speak. Tooth to nail is a military logistics term used to describe the ratio of military's combat soldiers to support personnel, which is usually around 40 to 60% combat and the rest support. Wagner Group is all combat arms. So, Russia has claimed that they have no control over the Wagner group. There's increasing evidence showing that they are simply an unofficial unit of the Russian military. And the evidence seems to be compelling here that they're either being financed directly by the Russian intelligence agencies, or they're integrated directly into regular Russian units like in Syria and Ukraine. And the fact that their training facilities near Ukraine is directly next to the Russian military base, I'm sure that's all just a coincidence. For Russia, the utilization of mercenary allows them to easily skirt around several issues that would come about if you were to use standard soldiers. The first is it allows them deniability. If a member of the Wagner group were to commit war crimes, or if a larger group of them were to fail in combat, Russia can simply say that they're in no way associated with this and the Russian government. This is what sparked their use in politically sensitive conflicts like the invasion of Crimea. Now you might wonder why Russia bothers trying to corral and coordinate multiple independent fighting forces instead of just adding more of their own conscripts to fight the replaced lost soldiers like they're known to do in previous wars. See, a large reason why Russia seeks to utilize these kinds of personnel, whether it be mercenaries or Chechens as ground troop numbers, is when they're looking at casualty numbers. They simply do not have to report them as killed or wounded, nor does the Russian government have to answer to its own citizens regarding the deaths of their own population. Casualty numbers can have a massive effect on both international levels of support in a conflict and the morale of soldiers on the front line. If you report massive daily casualties, other countries won't want to support you because you seem like you're a lost cause. The United States did the same thing when I was in Iraq. Around 7,000 US contractors were killed in Iraq and Afghanistan, which effectively doubles the war's body count. Second, it's a lot easier to recruit and re-up a mercenary force than an official army formation. Because they're technically an international company, they pull mercenaries from several countries surrounding Russia, not just Russian citizens. Anyone they deem competent enough with a rifle can be hired with the promise of a good paycheck. Now, mercenaries aren't the only ones fighting with Russian forces. Chechen forces have also been seen joining the fight. In the early months of the conflict, Russia proclaimed that 70,000 Chechen fighters were ready and willing to aid in the invasion of Ukraine. And while we have seen Chechen forces engaged in Ukraine, it's a long way away from 70,000. They also seem to be more focused on making TikToks and shooting at empty buildings than actual fighting. It's been widely speculated that the use of Chechen fighters was more of a psychological act rather than a practical military strategy due to their nature of cruelty and brutality in previous conflicts. It's likely the reason they've been plastered all over social media as a way of intimidating and creating uncertainty, though their actual effectiveness in the war has been questionable at best. There are reports of the Russian Wagner private military group recruiting directly from prisons. A video was even leaked showing Wagner's chief Yevgeny Prigozhin speaking to prisoners about potentially giving them the chance to serve for 6 months in Ukraine in exchange for freedom, meaning a full pardon or parole. This video was first leaked on Russian Telegram channels. A few things struck me as interesting from this video's full-length transcription that makes me think Putin really did not want this video released to the public. The Wagner group claims that the war in Ukraine is unlike anything they've seen before. Yevgeny says that ammunition expenditure in Ukraine is 2.5 times higher than it was during the Battle of Stalingrad. To give you an idea of what he's claiming, during the last month of Stalingrad alone, the Soviet army fired over 900,000 artillery shells, 900,000 mortar shells, and 24 million rifle rounds. Whether the Russian forces' rate of fire is truly that high or not, I think the main point of what he's trying to do here is scare these inmates so that no one thinks that this is just an easy way of getting out of their sentence. He wants to communicate to them that if they're going to go and do this for 6 months, it's not going to be easy, and it's not some kind of get out of jail free card. Wagner leader says at one point, "Whom do we need? We only need assault troops, stormtroops. 60% of my guys are assault troops, and you will be one of them." So I guess the tooth to nail ratio is more accurately 60% to 40% according to them. This all sounds like a new form of Russian roulette that I'm not familiar with. Osinit Technical reported on Twitter that the exact location of where these inmates are being recruited from is in Tambov, Russia. It's likely that they were taken from penal colony number 8 in Tambov in this video. Yevgeny Prigozhin outlines that basically any type of criminal who committed almost any sort of crime, even if they have a life sentence, are welcome to join his private military group as long as they're strong and physically fit, and they have to be within the ages of 22 to 50. That's the main age range, but the speaker in the video says that exceptions can be made. The Wagner group notes specifically that deserters who try to run away will be taken out by their own comrades. We saw video evidence of police vehicles transporting these prisoners to training where they will likely receive 1 month of training before being sent to the front lines. This creates a few major problems that people might not think about. First of all, 1 month is not nearly enough to turn into a soldier. The absolute least amount of time for US Army soldiers before deployment is typically 3 months of basic training, an additional 3 months of specific training at their unit before deployment. The other problem is discipline, with these soldiers being far more likely to hamper war efforts by not listening to orders or stealing supplies for themselves. The United States military, when I was in Iraq, was accepting just about anyone with a warm pulse. I mean, clearly I'm proof of the policy. But a lot of people don't realize that at one point, the US Army was giving out what was called moral conduct waivers. It was a program designed to lower joining standards to help reach troop strength goals. It allowed former convicts to enlist who would normally not be eligible. There's likely a percentage of these convicts who will make great soldiers and who will take the opportunity like this as a dream come true. In this case, having inmates on the front lines is going to increase their need for security to watch over their own troops to make sure they aren't trying to run away for their freedom. Having potentially 6,000 inmates already with arguably nothing to lose could be a problem and burden for their fellow soldiers. There's a potential that this is a tactic to release unruly people into Ukraine. At the very end, the Wagner group tells the prisoners, quote, "You have 5 minutes to decide. After that, we leave, and then it all depends on your luck." This is an old classic sales technique and psychological tool to help with his sales pitch here by creating a sense of urgency and a time limit in order to pressure them into saying yes. You've probably seen this technique used to sell a house or a car, but probably not a military. Moscow has fired 3,650 missiles and guided rockets within just the first 5 months of the war, according to the staff of the National Security and Defense Council. There are signs of confirmation that Russia's starting to run low on missiles. Ukraine intelligence estimates that Moscow only has 45% of its missiles remaining and likely only has 20% of their Iskander-M short-range ballistic missiles. Proof of this and its shortage comes from Russian forces using the S-300 as a land attack role instead of targeting aircraft that it's designed for. Now you might say, why doesn't Russia just rebuild their missile inventory? The problem is that the sanctions have crippled their ability to produce high-tech weapons because many of those missiles use Western electronics. A report found that 450 foreign-made components were inside Russia's weapons, like the 9M727 cruise missile recovered in Ukraine. Once they were disassembled, analysts found most of Russia's missiles rely on Western parts. In fact, 2/3 of the pieces were manufactured by US-based companies, including Texas Instruments. This is evidence that Moscow was using different technology from companies in US and Europe, parts that they no longer have access to. This is why Russia's turning to Iran, Korea, and China to try to make up the difference. In spite of those low stockpiles, Russia has successfully targeted some key pieces of infrastructure, like the Ukrainian train that reportedly had 200 Ukrainian reservist soldiers on board, in order to find a workaround for the sanctions. Russia is buying chips that are sold through distributors who are operating in Asia and Hong Kong. These companies are gateways that allow the Russian military and companies acting on its behalf to buy these parts. For instance, there are records from Russian companies that show in March of 2021, Russia front companies purchased $600,000 worth of electronics from Texas Instruments through a Hong Kong distributor in order to trick customs. A few months later, same Russian companies imported 1.1 million worth of microelectronics. Western countries will need to increase customs operations and aim to prevent these kinds of workarounds that the Russian military uses to get around sanctions with these clandestine networks that procure these sensitive components for Moscow. We're seeing headlines everywhere claiming that the North Koreans have 100,000 volunteers ready to aid Russia in the war effort. Dozens of social media reports and media outlets quickly shared the news that in exchange for grain and other supplies, Kim Jong-un would unleash hordes of super highly tactically trained, definitely not starving North Korean troops to fight with Russian soldiers and rebuild war-torn areas to their former glory. This claim originated from a Russian news pundit, but when asked to back these claims, he was unable to provide any proof that they were legitimate. Empty claims of other countries countries sending Russia support are not uncommon at this point, such as reports of Syria ready to deploy 40,000 soldiers to Ukraine hitting news outlets. But like the North Koreans, they have yet to materialize on the battlefield. Now, it's not just personnel that needs replacing on the battlefield. You have to somehow replace all the fuel, ammunition, and vehicles lost in combat. This is where Russia's neighbor China comes into play. When looking at China's support for Russia's military, however, it is important to consider some historical context to their relationship. Despite Xi and Putin's current bromance, official relations between China and Russia have always been a bit shaky. During the Cold War, the countries were anything but friendly with each other. As recently as 1969, China and Russia engaged in armed conflict over border disputes, and afterwards often fought proxy wars in order to gain opposing footholds within communist spheres of influence. It wasn't until the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991 that relations between the two countries normalized and grew to the level of cooperation we see today. It's important to consider these facts because they show that these two countries have historically been rivals and are only now reluctantly beginning to support one another. What this tells me is that it's more of an enemy of my enemy is my friend situation against Western entities like the United States and NATO. These kinds of relationships between countries can work generally at a surface level, but tend to cause serious breakdowns later on. Starting as early as 1991, China and Russia established treaties which settled all border disputes and reduced obstacles to bilateral trade, which specifically increased import of Russian weapons into China. Those imports slightly slowed, however, once Russia realized China was reverse engineering their own weapons based on Russian designs. I'm still waiting for MiG fighter knockoffs to hit AliExpress on the cheap. Ironically though, Russia and China realized that it would make more sense if the two were to cooperate in joint design efforts rather than try to rip each other off, and they began co-producing technologies such as fighter engines and advanced missile systems. As part of China's modernization efforts in the last 10 years, Russia has been a key player in providing fourth-generation fighter jets like the Su-35 and the latest generation of surface-to-air missiles in a combined effort to secure total air superiority in large-scale combat. This was an effort not only by China to increase its own military capabilities, but also shift Russian economic dependency onto China. This kind of cooperation has grown into a military-technical cooperation, basically an agreement between the two nations that makes it easy to share things like tactics, technology, material support, such as weapons systems or resources and training. Military cooperation between the two countries grew until 2014, when they took a shift during the invasion of Crimea. China began producing regular logistical support to Russia in the form of material goods and jointly produced air defense and missile systems. So then Russia has begun to rely on China not only as a source of income for arms sales, but now as a reliable way to acquire hard military resources. But critical equipment components for high-tech military computer systems, such as semiconductors and other electronics, have spiked since the invasion, while partially manufactured goods are increasingly showing up in Russian military factories. Importing of other aspects of military production, such as raw manufacturing materials to be used in rebuilding vehicles and weapons, are 400 times higher than in 2021 prior to the invasion. While materials flow into Russia's army, China has continued to increase its consumption of fossil fuels from Russia, such as a new coal trade worth 40 billion USD and an oil and gas trade of over 117 billion USD, both announced a week prior to the invasion in February. It's obvious that China is using these as a way to bolster Russia's economy, while also providing them with the raw materials needed in order to keep fighting a large-scale war. Does this mean that we can expect Russia and China, two of the largest and most advanced militaries in the world, to team up and start taking on Western powers? Not exactly. Both countries are wary of establishing a formal alliance, largely due to both being expansionist powers and having conflicting long-term goals for their respective countries. During a summit with the two nations, both leaders were asked if the increased military cooperation between the two countries signified an alliance between the two. China's response was that the two are not allies, but better than allies. Now, on the surface, this might sound like Putin and Xi are best friends, but it's actually just a really clever way of saying that China supports Russia without any of the actual obligations that would have to come with a military alliance. When Putin ordered the army to increase their size on August 25th, 2022, they did not state how they would be doing this, with conscripts or volunteers, or how they would achieve this goal. Ukraine's strategy has been to degrade Russia's equipment and ammo stockpiles, instead of trying to focus on attacking frontline soldiers. In June 2022, Russia announced the formation of the Third Army Corps. It's a very unusual group with an estimated strength of between 15 and 60,000 personnel. Army Corps in Russia means a formation even bigger than a division with tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, and artillery all rolled into it. There are a few reasons it's weird though. First, they're not integrated straight into existing units fighting in Ukraine, and are instead under their own command. This might suggest that Moscow doesn't trust some of the existing leaders. This unit has a strange amount of high-tech, brand new equipment like T-90M tanks and BMP-3s, which could be because they're drawing from fresh equipment that was meant to stay in the rear with training and garrison battalions. Pay was increased to about $5,000 a month, 4 times what soldiers normally earn in the Russian army. They were offered bonuses of 300,000 rubles, and they were often only given 1 month of training. Moscow Times reported that Russia had formed 40 battalions for the Third Army Corps, and the Institute of the Study of War estimated 34,000 troops had enlisted, and that's no small amount. They removed the age limit of 40 years old, so they now have 50-year-old men in this unit. They believe these troops are headed near Kherson, which means, according to the Russian field manual, they'll be the correct distance away from the front lines to safely stage there and move to Kherson. Russia's biggest win was acquiring attack drones from Iran in August. US officials believe hundreds of the Shahid series of drones will be delivered. Since Iran has been under heavy sanctions for many years, they've learned how to create drones without relying on the global supply chain. Britain's Ministry of Defense noted that Russia's use of radar reflectors near damaged bridges show how effective these attacks have been. UK intelligence said, quote, "The radar reflectors are likely being used to hide the bridge from synthetic aperture radar imagery and possibly missile targeting equipment. This highlights the threat Russia feels from increased range and precision of Western supplied systems." The eventual end result of the war in Ukraine will have historic implications on international politics for decades to come. So it's no surprise that we're seeing this many third parties provide aid for one side or another to help support their interests. But a large takeaway from this is that Russia is not necessarily alone in the fight. It might have the majority of the international community condemning its invasion, but amongst its few friends, you can see the level of commitment that its allies have provided give us a good indication of how far they would go for Russia or how little they're actually willing to help when bullets start flying. I want to thank Andrew Tucker, my associate producer, and Justin Taylor for helping research and write this video. If you guys liked it and you found it interesting, please hit the like button and subscribe. I'm your average infantryman, Chris Cappy. If you like this t-shirt, I designed it. You can buy it from underneath down there. I'll see you guys real soon.